I want to further review what Dawkins said, who's arguing against creationism. Begins with, much of the argumentation made for evolution is just that, an unfalsifiable tautology, something circular reasoning. For example, we hear arguments regarding the survival of the fittest, but when we define the fittest as those that survive, then we're really only saying the survival of those that survive. And that is a tautology, nonsense. It's unfalsifiable and untestable. Much of the argumentation made for evolution is like that. But if you find things out of sequence, things that should be at the top, in the middle, or at the bottom, then you have falsification. Continuing with the quotation, he says, ironically, it is also the reason why creationists are so keen on the fake human footprints, which were carved during the Depression to fool tourists in the dinosaur beds of Texas. Wow. Did you bother to go to check them out? Richard Dawkins, the blind watchmaker? Well, they've heard about our works at Glenrose, all the way to Oxford, and they acknowledge the implications. This would be sufficient to falsify the modern theory of evolution if those human footprints were true. So it got a lot of publicity because they couldn't prove it. So they just said, well, we just wanted to attract people to the park, so we just faked it. We can demonstrate that that's not the case. In fact, they are, genuine footprints, contemporary with that of the dinosaur. But if you find bones, that's not nearly as important as finding the tracks. You see, the tracks cannot be eroded and redeposited. Here we see bones that were found in the same formation as Dinosaur National Monument in the Dakota sandstone, many dinosaurs beautifully preserved. And here are two modern human skeletons. There's no question that it's human and that it's modern. They shouldn't be with the dinosaurs, according to evolutionists. They should be something like 100 million years apart. How come they're doing in that rock strata? What are they doing there? But evolutionists falsely claim without any evidence that this was an intrusional burial. No evidence. Automatically it's assumed by evolutionists that this is an intrusional burial because they can't be proved wrong, because they won't be proved wrong. They claim without proof, in other words, that the humans didn't originally die there but were transferred there later by some unknown means. Wow. I want you to be a detective on the police force. So you see then the importance of the tracks. Let's go to Glenrose, Texas. Here in the Biloxi River, Dinosaur Valley National State Park, we find that many beautiful dinosaur tracks, but in addition to the dinosaur tracks, we also have tracks that look very, very human-like. Let me go back here. Take a look at this website. I don't have it here because I'm not online right now, but you can take a look at these tracks and get their explanation there. In the meantime, let's go back where we were. Biloxi River Dinosaur Valley State Park, many beautiful dinosaur tracks, and we find tracks, and very, very human-like. Number of these tracks were found which continued back up under the bank of the river. After the initial discovery, they kept digging and digging, and they found underneath the bank of the river. That wasn't fake because it was buried, and they unburied it, which would not therefore be able to be carved as the evolutionist camp claims, because they weren't found until much later. Stan Taylor found a sequence of at least 6 human tracks in a right-left pattern that did not continue back up under the overburden, which was removed. Notice also the mud push-up surrounding the footprints, which argues strongly that this was not carved, and he shows a picture of that. The dinosaur stepped there first. A portion of it, the foreprint, filled in with the other material, and then the human stepped in it, leaving the depression of his foot within the dinosaur track. Now, the dinosaur, weighing a number of tons, made the initial impression, which was only an inch and a half deep, and then it was in that material, which was not quite as resistant, that the human stepped and left an impression. As some said, he just didn't carry enough weight to make a good impression with the normal substrate in the area, but let the dinosaur make the impression in order to walk safely in the animal's tracks, and since it infilled with slushier type material, he left a good imprint there also. Human, dinosaur first, and then human. Humans followed along. Just like you're walking along in a wilderness trail, you're going to find the easiest place to step. So in the Taylor trail, we have a double print. First the dinosaur stepping, then the infill material accounting for the flush appearance of the dinosaur track, and then the human stepping within it later. As we discovered this, we got some unexpected help from an unexpected source. Mary Leakey discovered a series of tracks in Africa, a series of clear tracks, a double track. One individual was stepping in the tracks of the other. Note that fossilized dinosaur footprints found all over the world are best explained by the catastrophic worldwide flood and not by slow and gradual geologic processes over millions of years. That's why man and dinosaurs could coexist, but they'd have to because of those, for example, those footprints at the Paluxy River in Texas. Notice a statement by Russell Tuttle, who's professor of anthropology at the University of Chicago and with the Primate Research Center at Emory University. He says the third individual, G3, carefully walked in the footprints of the second. He points out that the GWI hunters of southern Africa followed in the footsteps of the person ahead in order to minimize noise and to protect their feet. And says overprinting would be a prudent habit. So this is documented to be not that unusual a feature. In fact, when we notice animals walking along, cows following each other, they step in each other's tracks. When we looked at the entire sequence of tracks beginning down at the bottom of the Paluxy River, we see a river, a right, a left, a right, a left, a right, a left, and so on, up the trail. They're consistent. The rights are where they're supposed to be. The lefts are where they're supposed to be. In each of the 14 tracks, we find at least a general human shape. Those shapes are very consistent in length. 7 of them reveal individual toes, and not so, but individual human toes, not so other kinds of animals like apes. Now, none of Meriliki's showed the individual toes apart from the big toe. In 12 of them, you can discern right from left. The right-left pattern is consistent all the way, every one of them, all 14 of them, from one end to the other. And each of them is where it ought to be, and in the 110 million year old Glen Rose limestone, on the same platform, with literally hundreds of dinosaur tracks stepping in and across them. According to the evolutionary scenario, it couldn't have been there. Well, Dawkins tells us the significance of that. It would totally falsify the modern theory of evolution. So, the evidence points unmistakably to the fact that the evolutionary scenario will not fit with the facts. Furthermore, there's a great deal of additional evidence discovered at Glen Rose that is accumulating. We have the Burdick track, for example, that had been cut out of the river back in the late 30s, early 40s, and is a beautiful, almost perfect human-looking footprint. Since this had been cut out of the river bed, we were able to section this and saw it across at the heel. And I saw this specifically in the museum there at the Paluxy River, at the heel. And when we were able to look under the surface of the track, we can see the surface. And then under that surface, we see the disturbed area that conforms to the shape of the track, showing that this was not a carved track. This area of disturbed material of the rock directly under and conforming to the shape of the track proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that this track was not carved. We then saw it across the toes. There you go. And we see that there are actually pressure indications under each of the toes, especially under the great toe. There are obvious indications of pressure which follow the contour of that big toe in the rock, proving that this was not a carved track, that it was an actual track in the sediment. Some diehards continue to object, saying, well, the track is just too wide to be a human track. Dr. Tuttle at the University of Chicago and also the Primate Research Center at Emory responded to the charge that Meriliki's tracks were too wide by using this illustration in his article in Natural History. His foot is seen on the left. On the right, we see an Indian's foot that is habitually goes barefoot. He points out that this habitually barefoot foot is much wider than his. Yes, when you walk around without shoes, your feet get wider. A width to length comparison of this Indian's foot found that it was approximately 48% width to length. We were able to look at the Burdick track and measure precisely and found that the width to length ratio was 48%. So they're human tracks, right? And so the illustration that Tuttle had chosen to refute the charge of too wide regarding Meriliki's tracks likewise refuted that kind of an argument with the tracks that we found at Glen Rose. So the layer that the Burdick track came from was found in False Branch, which is a tributary of the Paluxy River. We see here the front end of the track that we had sawed across. The toe end is now set on the host rock. And we can see now those grape-sized calcite inclusions both in the host track and at the bottom of the Burdick track rock. We also did pin sections of the host rock and the matrix from the track and found that they matched perfectly. And so we find that it was not isolated from a different area. We know where it came from. In Lamb and Whitman's book on soil mechanics, we find diagrams that illustrate pressure structures that are formed when pressure is applied in a plastic medium. The structures that were in this Burdick track cross-section were actually better than the actual ones that they were able to form in the laboratory. We notice here in the illustration in the textbook, where the load is bearing down, the resulting structures go down and out somewhat like a mustache. We're talking about the toes in the mud. In this cross-section of the vertic tract toes, we notice directly under the second toe, especially concentrated under that inclusion where pressure would have been concentrated. The pressure goes down and out and back up. That can't be carved. And then under the toe, next to the little toe, again, we find a calcite inclusion, the pressure concentrate, and we find the mustache-type structure again. That's what happens when you put feet in mud and walk. And so again, we find further confirmation this is not carved. It was caused by pressure. But that's not all the evidence we see at Glenrose. We also have this, a cat track 9 inches across. This would have been made by a very large cat. And a large mammal discovered at the same time as the dinosaurs would be just as devastating to the theory of evolution and to the picture presented by the geologic column. What's a cat doing there with dinosaurs? We see the 4 toes and the pad of the cat beautifully preserved in a fossil. And so the response was, well, this one was carved too. Wow. Can you come up with something better than that? We saw it across one of the toes and noticed that this one did have the striations that were deformed by the pressure, proving again that this was not carved. And then we find this very dramatic fossil, a human finger. We see very clearly a fingernail-type structure and joints indicated. A number of anatomists have been astounded at the precise anatomical detail that we see in this beautiful three-dimensional fossil. Some have suggested that the three-dimensional fossils are so rare that you wouldn't expect to find such a fossil as this. And yet in Glenrose, we find all kinds of three-dimensional fossils. For example, the fossils of hundreds of soft-bodied earthworms, completely three-dimensional. We decided to section this finger, the finger fossil, and we see the bone structure delineated from what would appear to be the flesh and the epidermis at the outer edges. And so added to the other fossils is this beautiful three-dimensional fossil finger. And then we find this amazing fossil further down toward London, Texas, near Fredericksburg, again at the Cretaceous, but this time in sandstone, the iron hammer, which material proves out to be non-magnetic, suggesting that it was formed while the canopy over the Earth was intact, before the influence of outer space radiation. So, what has so far been found at Glenrose completely falsifies the picture presented by the geologic column. Notice the statement made by Ernest Mayr of Harvard University, one of the more famous evolutionists of our time, in the Gish-Mayr debate in Evansville, Indiana. And he said, creationists have stated that humans and dinosaurs were contemporaries in time. Were this momentous statement true, the names of its discoveries would thunder down the corridors of time as individuals have made out of one of the most outstanding discoveries in the 20th century. The implications are also seen clearly by Stephen M Stanley, a prolific science writer, a paleontologist from Johns Hopkins University, in his recent book, The Evolutionary Timetable. He said, there is an infinite variety of ways in which, since 1859, a general concept of evolution might have been demolished. Consider the fossil record, a little-known resource in Darwin's day. The unequivocal discovery of a fossil population of horses in Precambrian rocks would disprove evolution. Precambrian. That's at the beginning of creation, of their evolutionary point of view. More generally, any topsy-turvy sequence of fossils would force us to rethink our theory, yet not a single one has come to light. And, of course, it won't come to light as long as their eyes are closed and they refuse to see. Yes, they discount every discovery that the non-evolutionists find. When you have all the evidence that we summarized just a few moments ago, we have to ask, how much more would a reasonable person need? Beyond that, it gets to the point where they're just not going to see it. But he continues saying, as Darwin recognized, a single geographical inconsistency would have nearly the same power of destruction. See? So, now, these are his terms. Demolish, disprove, destroy. That's what he does. So anything that is discovered, is demolished, disproved, or destroyed. Dawkins of Oxford said it would falsify the theory these tracks were together, supposed to be 100 million years apart. And yet we demonstrate that they are together and that they're not falsified or carved, that they're original impressions in the sediment. Well, if the geologic column then does not represent the accurate explanation of what we find, then how do we account for the fossil record, those billions of fossil forms, billions of dead things that are found in rocks laid down by water all over the world? We find an average of a mile to a mile and a half of sedimentary rock containing billions and billions of dead things. Those who founded the sciences of geology and stratigraphy believe that this was done by a single catastrophic event, a great year-long catastrophic deluge, worldwide flood, involving many different depositional events, many different depositional environments, but in one great year-long catastrophic event, according to Genesis 6 in the Bible.